Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today, I'm joined again by my colleague, the international lawyer and human rights lawyer, Saul Takahashi, a US-Japanese dual national who's been practicing international law, human rights law for a very, very long time. Saul, welcome.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Pascal, and it's great to see you again. And thanks very much for having me.
It's great that we can do this again because you were actually, when we first met, you were actually in Japan, but then changed track and you moved to the UAE. And you
Yes.
were actually in the United Arab Emirates until just a couple of days ago. And today we're speaking on April 3rd. 2026. You were actually caught in the UAE when everything happened. Can you maybe give us a very short overview of your background and how you came then to work in the UAE, what you did there, and we'll take it from there.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. So like you mentioned, I'm an international human rights lawyer. That's my specialty, international human rights law and international humanitarian law. I started off my career working for Amnesty International in Tokyo, and then I went on to work for Amnesty International, the International Secretariat, so the international headquarters, if you like, in London. And then it was sort of a natural career progression onto the UN. And I did several posts in the UN. My last position was as deputy head of office of the UN Human Rights Agency in occupied Palestine. So that was from 2009 to mid 2014. I lived in Jerusalem. My the main office was in Ramallah, but of course we had offices all over the West Bank and also in Gaza. So I traveled quite extensively all over Palestine. Our job mainly was to document and to report on human rights violations and provide those reports to bodies like the Human Rights Council, General Assembly, and like that. We also did a bit of capacity building for Palestinian civil society and the PA. So I left the UN in 2014 and I came back to Japan. I went back to NGO work for a little bit, but then from 2019, I was teaching full time at a very small women's university in central Osaka. And that was until last August when I moved to the UAE, like you mentioned, and I took up a position as a visiting professor at New York University, Abu Dhabi. So that was a 1 year position. There was talk of an extension, and it looked like it would be extended. Unfortunately, my job has become a victim of the war, I'm afraid, because I was just told the other day that unfortunately, with everything happening, they're going to have to cut back quite drastically on the visiting positions, and so unfortunately, I'm sort of out of a job. So that's kind of bad news for me. But of course, it's really nothing. It's a first world problem,
Mm.
and I can't compare it with what's going on in Gaza, of course, and Lebanon and the like. But like you mentioned, so yes, I was caught. Um, I was, caught, if you like, in the UAE when all of this started. I think, like most people, I sort of expected it to end in a few days, and boy, was I wrong. I really do want to stress, I didn't feel unsafe in the UAE in any way. I mean, people react to these kind of situations in a different way. I do feel, some people were panicking, but people react to these situations in a different way. Of course, I was in Palestine. I've had these kind of experiences of missiles flying over my head and, having to evacuate. I mean, this is, when you're in the UN in these kind of places, this is just sort of part and parcel of the whole thing. So I wasn't, I certainly didn't feel unsafe. Every now and then there would be a couple of times a day, maybe, we would get these deafening alerts on our phones, and then after maybe like a few minutes, there would be sounds of explosions in the air, and those would be the sounds of missiles being intercepted. So, I mean, it was fine. I don't mean to belittle the tragedies, of course, because if you're at the wrong place at the wrong time, then the debris from the missiles that were intercepted, they come down. Obviously, they fall down to the ground, and you can get hit. And I think I can't remember the exact number, but a small number of people have actually been killed because of that. So, that kind of thing can happen if you're at the wrong place at the wrong time. But all in all, I mean, people are pretty much going about their normal lives. Pretty much. I mean, the shops are all, certainly when I was there, the shops were all open. There was plenty of food. We're talking about a very wealthy country, obviously, and a country that has a lot of logistical capacity in terms of, you know, making sure that there's a supply of everything you need, from water to food to everything. So there were, it was really quite normal. I mean, the malls were open, everything was fine. It's just that NYUAD made the decision relatively early on that the classes were going to go online for the rest of the term. And then a few days later, the campus was closed down out of a abundance of caution. I was living on campus, so that meant we had to evacuate. We had to, they put us in a hotel, and again, first world problems. It was a five-star hotel in the Gulf. I mean, there was a pool and a gym, and it was very nice. Again, we weren't lacking for anything, but it wasn't the kind of place that you wanted to stay for months and doing your classes and that kind of thing. So we made the decision to leave. And that was actually a little bit, well, again, I don't mean to make a big deal out of it, but there was a little bit of stress surrounding that, because within the UAE it was fine, but the airport was very unpredictable. And so, leaving was a little bit of stress. We weren't sure. And then there was a Japanese evacuation flight, but we couldn't get on it at first. And it was, there's this kind of every day, every few hours, there was this kind of what's going to happen kind of thing. But we were pretty fortunate in that we had tickets to Europe that we had booked way back in December, because it was the midterm break. So we had kept those tickets, and by the time our dates of travel by the time they came around, the airport was more or less functioning okay. So we there were some scares till the very last minute, but we did manage to get on, and we again, I don't mean to over dramatize any of this. I mean, I don't mean to act like we were, refugees with the shirts on our back and, fleeing from Beirut. I mean, I spent a week in Paris living it up, and then, I had the resources to come back to Japan. So, I'm very lucky, and everything was fine.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascallotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. So luckily things worked out, and luckily, I mean, also for the people still living in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and so on, I mean, it is not a humanitarian catastrophe, and as you said, the level of destruction and even the level of threat is like infinitely smaller than like what people in genocide at Gaza are going through, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
We the first time we spoke online actually was when the genocide was in its third or fourth month. We are now 2 years in, and we know that hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in Gaza. I mean, nobody who still has any kind of sense left would dispute that it is a genocide at this point. And if you then compare this to the level of warfare that we are seeing right now, on the one hand, you of course have the US-Israeli attack on Iran. On the other hand, you have Iran then striking back targets in these allied nations, right? Which they themselves, they host these US bases, they help the United States logistically, but they themselves do not send their army or their own missiles into Iran. So we have this weird situation in which now the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain, they are basically shock absorbers for the war that the United States started. I mean, do you have any what was the sense on the ground of people that you talk to? Are people blaming Iran for what is happening, or are they blaming the United States for pushing the region over the brink?
Well, I think the general sense in the region, and I'm talking about the Gulf, is basically blaming both. I mean, that's certainly my sense of everything. Um, Getting into the sort of international law aspect of this, the Gulf nations have stated repeatedly that they have prohibited the U.S. from launching attacks in the bases in those countries. So basically, their argument has been from the beginning that yes, there are U.S. bases, but they perform different functions. They're defensive bases or whatever. And so, they're not, we, the Gulf nations, are not complicit in these attacks. And for sure, I mean, for sure, they're unhappy with the attacks on the Gulf. I mean, excuse me, the attacks on Iran, and they tried to forge a diplomatic way forward, and they tried to discourage the U.S. And perhaps indirectly, in many cases, Israel from launching these attacks. And the U.S. and Israel just went ahead without, it seems, even telling them. So they are very unhappy about that, for sure. But about getting back to the international legal aspect, it is very true that the international definition of aggression, it doesn't include just hosting bases. So as long as the US is not launching attacks from these bases, the Gulf nations certainly do have a point. I mean, that they are not, legally speaking, they're not complicit in the attacks on Iran. Now, I, as an international lawyer, and just sort of getting sort of taking one step back from the situation in the Gulf. But as a lawyer, I have to say, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this because, it is true when you look at the GA resolution on the international definition of aggression, and you look at, that was basically taken, basically copied and pasted into, into the work of the ICC and all this kind of stuff. So when you look at those, it's true. I mean, hosting bases in and of itself is not an act of aggression. But, you are freeing up resources from the country of the bases. You're basically you're hosting American bases. You're freeing up American military resources, for them to, that they might otherwise have spent. So I would certainly argue that there's a certain element of indirect complicity. And, I'm a little bit unhappy with this definition as we have now. I mean, the Gulf nations, they legally, they're correct. I mean, this is the definition we have. But I think, this is something that, I mean, certainly the Gulf nations are rethinking their hosting on the bases. But, I think that, we have to rethink of this whole thing.
Yeah, this is a very, very theoretical point I now want to make, but I still want to make it because this situation opens up a new kind of challenge actually in international law, because what happens when war breaks out, historically, or how international law, especially before 45, was crafted, is like when war is a fact, then the warfaring parties, the belligerents, are of course governed by the law of war, which today we call international humanitarian law, right? That's the governing framework. The ones who don't go to war, they are then automatically governed by the law of neutrality.
Right.
But the law of neutrality, especially after the Hague Rules, mandates that you cannot host foreign troops, or that if you do, you need to intern them, right? So basically, the after the Hague Rules, or under the Hague Rules, the Gulf countries cannot really claim that kind of traditional neutrality, which then means if they still say we are not a belligerent, that would mean that they are kind of in a space that is undefined under international law, or Iran can legally argue, no, you are a co-belligerent, therefore we are fair game. It's highly theoretical, but still that's how international law has developed over the centuries, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very sort of gray area. I mean, this whole sort of, this sort of area between the like you say, the law of neutrality and the law of, the definition of aggression and all these kind of things. And, but in fact, one of the points that I think should be made is Japan is no longer a neutral country, I would certainly argue. And I wrote something to this effect in a Japanese magazine. It just got published the other day, but I do certainly hope that people hear, they look at this and they read this and they realize what's going on, because, American warships are lobbing missiles into Iran. Many of them are, or at least several of them are based in Yokosuka. Also, this Marine battalion, or whatever it is, this unit, of a couple of thousand Marines that are that have, I think, arrived already in the Gulf. They are based in Japan, in Okinawa. So bases in Japan are being used to launch attacks on Iran. And this is a level of complicity that goes even further than the Gulf nations. The Gulf nations, like I said, they have a very valid, legally speaking, they have a very valid point, that they have prohibited the US from launching attacks on these bases. We can argue, like you mentioned, the law of neutrality, and, there are other arguments. But with Japan, I mean, there's no room to argue that anymore. I mean, these bases are being used. And, that's really important, I think, because as you're very aware, because you also live here in Japan, the discourse is always, the narrative is always, yeah, the Americans are here to protect us. So we can't do anything that would upset the Americans. We can't do anything that would, that would make them, rethink this alliance. And we can't do anything that would, make them rethink this relationship of I would say, real reliance that we have, that Japan has on the US in terms of security. But the fact of the matter is, these US bases, there are treaty obligations. God knows whether, somebody like Trump or any other subsequent president would ever honor those. But, there are treaty obligations about protecting Japan. But the point is, these are these are part of the US global military strategy. And these bases have been and they are being used to launch, these escapades into various different regions, not even just, our region, but, the region of the Middle East and, God knows where else. So this is something which really needs to be, rethought and needs to be understood, I think.
Yeah, very, very much so. And Japan, of all countries, actually has an interest in having a good relationship with Iran because it wants to add its. I mean, not just from Iran, but from the Gulf, right?
Yes.
And Japan historically have had a good relationship with Iran. During the last crisis in 2019, then Prime Minister Abe actually rushed to Iran, to my big surprise, like taking a big, political risk of trying to broker some form of understanding. It kind of failed, but the fact that he tried and that he was received in Iran at the time, right, tells you a lot that they were trying to have a good relationship. But if you do that now with and having these bases over here, it's that changes the equation. But until now, I must say, until this war, the bases were always seen as a security guarantee by the United States, right?
Yes,
Make sure that they will come to help the Japanese, right? But now, I mean, these bases in the Gulf, the Gulf states are proving they are not security. They are a magnet.
Yes.
The bases are
actually
magnets at the radar systems and so on. I mean, one of the first things the Iranians took out was the radar systems. And of course, the UAE can say, oh, they're only defensive. It's like, yeah, sure. I mean, radar. Yeah, it's a lot of these systems is illusionary to differentiate between defense and offense. So maybe two questions. So how does this now impact the thinking in the UAE and the Gulf states about their security relationship with the United States? And have you heard, read, seen something about Japan? Actually, people starting saying like, oh, we might also have a problem, or is it just you and I who kind of notice this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, about the UAE and the Gulf nations in general, I don't have any sort of great insight into internal political deliberations and what's going on there. But, you hear reports about these things, and for sure, I mean, there's a lot of rethinking of this. I mean, the whole strategy and the whole deal really was that, like in Japan, these bases were a security guarantee. These bases were, these bases were a security guarantee, and should something happen, then the U.S. would help defend them. And as you say, it's actually acted as a magnet. It's sort of, in a way, it's sort of similar to the old adage, when people talk about Israel, when Americans talk about Israel, and they say, well, Israel's our only ally in the Middle East, then the answer to that is, yeah, well, we didn't have any enemies until we started this blind support of Israel. So it's almost, the same, if you look at it, if you sort of step back and look at it, then it's almost that kind of thing. So for sure, there's a lot of rethinking. I don't think, tomorrow the Gulf nations are going to demand that the bases depart. Tomorrow, the Gulf nations are going to, halt all their massive investment in the US economy. This is not how they operate. And I think it'll be a little bit more gradual and a little bit more slow. But, these are very strategic countries, in particular, like the UAE. they have a long-term view, and they are very strategic in how they spend their resources. And for sure, I think there's very little doubt that the policymakers are really rethinking all of this, and rethinking, what is this all about? And you see already, like for example, the Saudis forging a defense alliance with the Pakistanis, and this kind of block of 4 countries. I think it was Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. Them trying to forge some sort of block to coordinate the security policy. So for sure, there's a lot of rethinking going on. I think you know probably the changes, and we'll see. I mean, I could be proven wrong, but the changes, I think, will probably not be so dramatic that a lot of us, kind of think, or like to talk about. It's not, again, it's not going to be tomorrow. There's a big announcement from the GCC that all the U.S. bases have to leave. I kind of doubt that, but for sure there will be a gradual decoupling, if you like, from the U.S. and from this kind of security umbrella. And Pax Americana is really in the toilet, and it's it's just it's really pathetic. You asked me another question. I can't.
In Japan, have you
Oh,
heard
yes.
people in Japan talk about the same, like, oh, these spaces are a problem? I mean, we know that in the Japanese parliament at the moment, there is one lawmaker. He's one of the leaders of one of the opposition parties who keeps saying, like, Japan is a colony. It's a colony. We're a colony as long as we have these bases. But he got a little bit popular with this, but he's still like a lone voice with that, I think, in parliament, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, the political elite in Japan have invested so much for so long. When I say so long, we're not talking centuries, obviously. We're only
But
talking
80 years.
yeah, 80 years. I mean, it's something. And they've, completely gone all in with investment in the military alliance with the United States, and with fealty to the US being basically an ends upon itself. So, there isn't too much open talk, let's put it that way, at least, within the political elite. But for sure, discussions are taking place. People aren't stupid, and they see this. And you know, I think also with Trump, I mean, being the president of the United States and being so overtly obnoxious, dismissive of allied countries, so belligerent, so basically stupid. It's just like every single quality that is really repulsive to, not only sort of the policymaking circle, but just Japanese in general, and to decent people everywhere. It just, this is really this has really turned people off, and this is really sort of pushing people to understand, look, the Americans aren't reliable anymore. This is the thing. When during the first Trump, Trump 1.0, I think it's often called, the first Trump administration, you know, it was bad. It was, there were very bad messages being sent around the world. But let's face it, he didn't accomplish that much. I mean, very negative messages were sent. I mean, domestically, of course, and of course internationally. So, but at the end of the day, he was so incompetent, and there was still what people call the axis of adults, the axis of grown-ups in the room, who somehow managed to stop his more negative impulses. That, somehow, there's a sense, and maybe it's not correct, but there's a sense that somehow America and the old global order emerged relatively unscathed from it.
And he wasn't that belligerent during his first term. And secondly, the Japanese, at least in my observation, they all thought it's 4 years and then it will be over and we will go back. And Biden was kind of the reaffirming, it's fine. And now second Trump is like, no. And even after Trump, even if he died tomorrow, this thing ain't gonna go away. So the kind of that reconceptualizing is happening in Japan, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. I mean, people are finally realizing, look, this is not a short-term thing. This is not, Donald Trump is obviously, he's a negative force, and obviously we want him to, get out of the picture as soon as possible. I dream of him, being led away in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. But, the point is, even should he be gone tomorrow, there are plenty of guys to take his place. And this is, already in Trump 1.0, this was very clear, but still, millions, almost 80 million Americans thought he was the guy for the job.
Yeah.
This is not going to go away. And if you look at, I mean, there are plenty of guys in the queue to take his place. I mean, there's
Yeah.
Vance and Rubio, who is, I mean, Hegseth, God willing, will be, out of the picture as soon as Trump disappears, and he's going to crawl back under whatever rock he came from.
Church.
But yeah, but there are plenty of there are plenty of these guys, and this is not going to go away. So I think I completely agree. The Japanese policymakers, though they are not open about it, they're not stupid, and they see that this is not going to go away, and the Americans in the long term are not the reliable rock of they're not the reliable partner that that the Japanese, had assumed them to be for 80 years. And the same goes for the Europeans. They've realized that just sort of hunkering down and waiting for the 4 years to pass, it's just not, gonna happen. This is just not gonna work anymore. And I think finally, also the Europeans are trying to figure out what sort of way forward they can forge.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I would just point out that, often Japan is looked at as like a Asian version of Europe, and I would say like that's not the case. Like one thing that is really different is that Japan is not, I would say, ideologically as captured as the Europeans are,
Mhm.
and there is um pragmatism over here, and relatively a healthy form of nationalism, I would say, in the sense
Mm.
of that they don't want Japan to be attacked. I mean, that's the last thing they would want, right? And
That's
and
for
and
sure.
what this one drives kind of home is that, not only that the US can like launch such a war, but then it cannot protect these countries. I mean, if the United States cannot protect the UAE from Iran, how the hell is it going to protect Japan from China? Just like,
Yes,
how
yes.
would that work? This one
Yeah.
is dropping now, isn't it? And I don't know if you had the time and space during the last couple of weeks also to follow, Prime Minister Takaichi's visit to Washington, or what happened in
Mhm.
December with her fallout with China. Do you have any observations about this? Also, how Takaichi, as kind of a, she tries to portray to be a really good ally of Donald Trump, but I feel that also looking at the media, how she sold the trip over here. She's like, she's proud. The proudest thing is that there was no fallout, that she managed to convey that
Yeah.
there's things we can do and things we cannot do. And she actually used Article 9, the pacifist article, which she
Yes.
herself wants to change. She used that in order to tell him, look, we cannot help you as much as you would like to. We would love to, but we have a constitution. Do you have any observations about this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I'm not a fan of Takaichi by any means, of course. She comes from the extreme right wing of the party. I've always had the sense that she herself is, a firm believer in xenophobia and racism, and she's just not, it's just not great that she's prime minister. It's not great that she's leader. But I have to say she's done a good job with regards to this. I mean, when she went to DC, I think it was the 19th of March. It was just a couple of days after Trump, just another one of his latest bombshells, saying that, we expect all the other countries, that rely on oil through the Strait of Hormuz, we expect them to, do their share in patrolling and protecting, the oil tankers through the straits, and we'll continue on with bombing Iran into Kingdom Come, but everybody else has to play their part. He even mentioned China, which was, kind of hilarious. But she did a good job, I have to say. I mean, she was, of course, very obsequious, at least, certainly in front of the cameras. She was very obsequious, and, it was kind of disgusting, but she did a good job. I mean, everybody was afraid that she was going to go, and that Trump was going to really come on down hard on her and saying, insist, demand that Japan send warships, tomorrow. But she did a good job in fobbing him off. So I have to say
Saying
that's
no
good.
to him without him exploding in her face, right? That's actually
Yeah.
not easy to do.
It's not easy for her to do, and she's, I hate to say this, but being, let's call a spade, being a woman in Japanese politics, it ain't easy, and I'm sure she has a lot of experience in, sort of being obsequious and sort of getting her way and maneuvering around powerful men. And she did a good job. I mean, I have to admit it. I have to hand it to her. She did a good job with this. And so,
But
let's see. I mean, I think that's good, but she's not, again, she's I'm not a fan of her. She's from the very extremist xenophobic wing of the party, but she's at the beginning, I felt she had, very little to say in terms of, again, very little to say and do except for, aside from xenophobic and racist statements. But she's not stupid.
Yeah.
And, she seems to realize that she's got to maneuver around this, and there has to be some sort of long-term way forward, which doesn't, not saying excluding the Americans totally, but that, doesn't involve complete and utter reliance on the Americans for everything.
That kind of, even in these circles, must be pretty clear by now, which also means that they're probably, again, like Japanese are more pragmatic than one would hand it to them in my observation.
It's interesting you say that. Yeah.
That there must be thinking of like something needs to be done with China, right? As in, we have to have a strategy forward, because there was this huge fallout in December when she basically said, yes, a Chinese military vessel sailing toward Taiwan would be an existential threat to Japan, and China took this so bad, and because it evoked so many memories of Japanese militarism, and she kind of fulfilled the already existing Chinese perception that Japan is going militarist again, right? So, and do you also perceive that this was probably not a planned announcement, and it was probably regrettable even to her government that it went this way? Or how do you interpret that scene in December?
Well, again, her December remarks were really stupid, and that was a big faux pas, and she really sort of stepped into it. So that she's one of the criticisms of her has been that she is a foreign policy novice and she knows nothing about diplomacy and any of this. And certainly, that statement about China was, it sort of proved her critics right. I mean, that was really dumb. And I remember very clearly, the Chinese, like all of a sudden the Chinese tourists disappeared from Japan, and the Japanese economy started to tank just because of that. And that was really dumb. But I think she's more than made up for that with how she's handled Trump. I mean, I'm looking back at the first Trump administration. This was very interesting because that was still under Abe. Abe was prime minister, and I don't mean to talk ill of the dead, but I loathed Abe. He was a fascist and an ideologue, and I really felt that him being prime minister was harmful to Japan in many ways. But during the first Trump administration, it was very interesting seeing how Abe and the political elite were maneuvering, because you could tell that there were outreaches made to the Chinese. They were not, sort of widely reported on in the headlines. They weren't headline grabbing stuff, but very sort of almost informal. But there were sort of peace branches that were being given to the Chinese, and you can tell that there was a realization already during the first Trump administration amongst the political elite that, hey, things are not going as we thought. Things are not going as planned here. Maybe we may have to have a better long-term strategy. Then, of course, Biden came in, and we all remember the first thing he said was, America is back, and, everything is back as normal. So the extremist right wing of the party, they seemed like, they seemed ascendant, and they seemed happy, and, everything sort of seemed like it was going back to normal. But, with what's going on now, for sure, I mean, there's definitely a realization that there has to be a longer term strategy with China. We have to figure out some way to coexist with China in a peaceful way that we both prosper. And there's no question in my mind that we can do this. I mean, one thing that's really shocked me after I came back to Japan in 2014, after living 20 years abroad, it was just the sheer bullish nationalism that I saw in the public discourse, the media, the politicians. Anything and everything was China's fault. Anything and everything, was the Chinese threat. It was, Chinese threat to this, a Chinese threat to that. Hey, it's terrible weather we have lately. No, yeah, it's the Chinese fault. I mean, it was really over the top. And every time I had Chinese students, in my classes, like I would start off the class by like apologizing to them because it's really terrible. I'm old enough to remember that it wasn't like this before. I mean, there was trepidation, there was, concern about China, and China was rising and they were going to take our place. But, really since 2010, I think it was, when China overtook Japan as the second biggest economy, that's when I think things really started to go wrong, and this kind of bullish nationalism started coming to the forefront, and the really extremist wing of the LDP, they started gaining power, and then Abe became premier, and then it was all sort of downhill from there. But there's no question, we can do this, and we can have a perfectly peaceful and prosperous coexistence with China. There's no doubt in my mind that we can do this, and we have to do this. The thing is, just sort of in closing, the thing about the United States, and this is one thing that a lot of the rest of the world, I mean, they sort of understand in a sort of intellectual way, but it's difficult to really understand and conceptualize. Americans don't understand what it means to fight a war in your country, because it's never happened. It hasn't happened since the Civil War. Americans have not been attacked on the mainland. It didn't happen until that's why 9/11 was such a huge shock to them. And there are all these theories about what really happened and everything, but I do really, I can sort of honestly understand how Americans could just, it's like this, they couldn't conceive it. To the Americans, fighting a war is, we go off to a country far, far away that nobody has heard of, that nobody can point to on a map. And, we beat the bad guys with overwhelming force. Then we come back to the big PX and everything is as normal. And, this is something that, Japan and Europe, through two world wars, especially for Japan, the Second World War, this is just a completely different way of understanding what war means. And now what's happening in the Gulf, it's the same thing. The Americans, they start off just moving fast and breaking things, and when Trump gets tired of this, it's like, I'm just, I'm this is too difficult for me. I can't understand it anymore. I'm kind of tired of it, and we're just going to pack up and go home. We're going to declare victory and go. I don't know what's going to happen, but there's always that danger. And then they pack up and they go home, and the rest of the world, the rest, in particular the Gulf nations, they're left holding the bag. And so this is why it's very, very dangerous to rely on the Americans for this kind of thing, because they have a completely different way of seeing the world in this area.
I mean, it's good that you're talking about this, because I do think this is probably one of the lessons that Japan currently, even in the LDP circles, is actually kind of learning. Although I would, of course, argue that the case is even much worse. I mean, holding the bag is one thing, but being used as a staging ground for a proxy war, like Ukraine, that's even worse, right? You're faced into an implementation partner of a US war that you then fight on behalf of them. And I am absolutely 1,000,000% sure that the neocons in Washington, they do think about how to do that with Japan, or actually, I think they're going to try to do it through the Philippines. But, if they manage to provoke a war with China over Taiwan or the Philippines, then Japan will automatically, almost like machines, clockwork, be drawn into it because of the bases, right? And
yes.
So this proxy war thing is probably not something that's at the forefront of people's minds here in Japan, but it is. I wonder if it is one of the lessons that at least some people are starting to think about.
Yeah, you have a really good point there, and I think you're right. People haven't, people are still sort of grappling with the realization that the United States is not a reliable partner, and that, when things hit the fan, they're not going to protect us. But what you're saying goes even further, because the US is basically, what you're saying is that, there's a chance that they will actively provoke a war, and then, Japan's going to be dragged into it. And like you mentioned, the neocons in Washington will stop at nothing. And the Christian evangelists, the Christian fundamentalist wing of Washington, the whole MAGA movement, these people are just, they really are crazy. This is the biggest threat to world peace that I think we have ever seen. It's we have in English, we have this expression, it's not the end of the world, or these people, whatever happens, it's not the end of the world. But a lot of these people, they actually want to bring about the end of the world. I mean, this is
the Secretary of
their
War,
philosophy.
Pete Hegseth, is like, no, please, Armageddon now.
Yeah, it's hard to come up, it's hard to point to a lower specimen of humanity than Pete Hegseth. But he represents, like you mentioned, I mean, those statements of his that represent, they represent this wing of the MAGA movement and of these crazies. I mean, it is extremely dangerous. It is, we are really looking at a very dangerous situation, and it is a time of monsters, like Gramsci said. A lot of people are quoting him and paraphrasing him, and I'm guilty of it too. But it's true. I really do feel that the old regime has seems to have just collapsed. The new regime is not on its feet yet. We don't know what's going to happen, and now is the time of monsters, when these crazies are going around and doing what they want.
My main problem is that the old narrative is still sticking with us, very much like the bases. How the Europeans pretend that, oh, Iran. I mean, literally, I talked this morning to just for a meeting with Jeffrey Sachs, and he told me he was there when the Security Council had their first meeting on Iran, and they started off with Bahrain, who said like the unprovoked attack on our country, and then UAE, unprovoked attack on our country. The whole Security Council then condemns the because China and Russia abstained, signed a resolution saying like Iran is committing a grave crime under international law by attacking the Gulf states, and you're just like left there wondering like, what the hell? Europeans have the same kind of speech. So the perception, of course, the perception is now breaking, because people are actually seeing, oh no, this started when the US did an act of aggression. But the narrative is still there, and I think like even in Japan, they're still like caught in this. We need to go along with the narrative in order not to upset the big guy.
Yes. Yeah, definitely, and I completely agree with you. You're right. That's a really good point. The narrative is definitely still there, and for sure, well, I mean, the media in Japan is, tends to be a little bit better than the media, for example, in the United States. But still, I mean, it's, they're sort of stuck between this rock and a hard place, and they do, they convey the dominant narrative in the same way. So, yeah, you're definitely you're right, and that was just yet another one of the sad and pathetic days in the UN, where this resolution was adopted. Completely coming down hard on Iran for the attacks and for closing the Straits of Hormuz, and I mean, fair enough, that has to be pointed out. But wait a minute, what about the completely overtly illegal acts of aggression by the United States and Israel? But I mean, I spent my entire career talking about international law and trying to sort of uphold these international mechanisms and the UN, and I'm feeling I'm wondering where I went wrong, and what sort of career choices where I made these wrong career choices, because already, like, obviously last November was a very big turning point for me. I mean, already obviously I was 5 years in Palestine, and I could see how the geopolitics were influencing and preventing the UN from doing what it was supposed to do, and preventing the UN as in the civil service of the the organization, but also how the geopolitics in these political bodies were working. But last November, when the UN Security Council adopted this resolution endorsing Trump's quote unquote peace plan, which is really a plan for colonization and domination and exploitation, and endorsing this board of peace, despite the fact that it wasn't even clear that the board of peace hadn't been established yet formally. I mean, it wasn't even clear what it was going to do, and then later on you open the box and it's completely different as it was advertised. It was just, this was a really sad day. I mean, this was a day that will live in infamy for sure. And I think this was really, to me, probably one of, if not the final nail in the coffin of the UN as a credible actor in international affairs in general, and certainly with Palestine, because it was just utterly pathetic that no member of the Security Council even dared to speak up to the bully and vote against this. It was really a disgrace, really a disgrace.
No, it was, but I I belong to the people who are still convinced that, you know, international law, even if it's not working yet, it is exactly where we have to go, right? And in this sense, you're just like a gifted piano player in 1250. The piano isn't here yet, but that doesn't mean that that's not where we should be going, right?
Right,
We have to develop the goddamn piano so we can play it virtuously, right?
Yeah, sure.
But so in that sense, we're just not at the end of the development, and it's kind of also no surprise that a post Second World War institution that was founded by the victors of the Second World War, who then basically stayed, with the exception of the China seat that changed, that remained unchanged, that thing would become useless once the power distribution changes. And apparently the power distribution is changing right now. Again, the United States cannot defend the UAE, cannot defend Qatar and Kuwait from Iran. That's just by now a fact. And where do you see this actually then? Where do you see it going? Having also been there, with the thinking like in West Asia around how to organize this, because you said like, okay, Pakistan, like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and so on are talking, but Pakistan has a security relationship also with Iran. Do you think that they're gonna try to organize something regionally in order to somehow stabilize things?
I mean, I think that's the direction that things are going. I mean, you know, it's almost trite now to say that we live in a multipolar world, and you know that there will be, you know, various different centers of power, and everything is going to be shifting, and everything is going to be a little bit more unpredictable. But you know, as trite as it may sound, I mean, I do think that's where we're going, and certainly in West Asia, you know, that's probably the direction that we're heading. Again, I don't think it's the kind of thing that's going to happen like in a really dramatic way tomorrow. I could be wrong. You know, I mean, nobody predicted the Cold War, you know, the wall coming down. Nobody predicted, you know, the quote unquote Arab Spring. You know, there can be very dramatic changes from, you know, seemingly very innocuous events. So, you know, I wouldn't rule anything out, but in general, the way that the thinking is of, you know, the policymakers in West Asia and in most places in the world, you know, they want stability, they want gradual transitions, they don't want a really sort of dramatic revolutionary change, because that always brings with it some sort of danger and anxiety. So, you know, it'll probably be gradual. You know, like I mentioned before, it's not going to be that tomorrow the Gulf nations demand the US, you know, take away the bases. It's not going to be that tomorrow all of a sudden there's going to be a big regional organization that will pool its military and, you know, act and have its own sort of Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Right? It's probably not going to be like that. It'll be a little bit more gradual, and you know, the American sort of, you know, receding down in the horizon will be a little bit more. You know, it'll take a little bit of time, but definitely that's where we're heading. And you know, I say that, but with full realization that people are being killed right now, and people are, you know, people are paying, you know, huge prices right now for this, as the system, you know, breaks apart the current system that we have, or at least the old system. And that's, you know, that's a problem, obviously. Like you, I do believe that, you know, international law, I do believe in international law, and we mustn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and we have to, you know, we have to apply these standards in a fair and proper, you know, way. And that means accountability for violations, in particular with Israel. You know, Israel has to be held accountable. And you know, both in a sort of in the state of Israel has to be held accountable internationally, but also people who commit crimes against humanity have to be held criminally responsible. So that really has to happen. And you know, I very much hope that this happens tomorrow. I very much hope that we see that.
Yeah, but even if we can't do it tomorrow, I mean, it must be a long-term goal, right? Because the current state is just not, it's just not something that is acceptable for the next 1,000 years.
Sure.
It's just like you know, the current situation actually gives a bit more clarity, right? I mean, the genocidal nature of the Zionist project of Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism, of, you know, slaughtering masses of people in order to get Lebensraum for themselves in this region. I mean, that is becoming more clear now than it was before, isn't it? And also the United States kind of the hardcore colonial approach to like say like, no, this is our hemisphere. And if we don't like a president somewhere in South America, we go in, we take him out, and we parade him around in New York. By the way, this is just what we do. Rah, rah, rah.
We should just take the oil.
We just take the oil. And I feel it's kind of a moment of clarity, but I was wondering about your perception also on this really not just neo-colonial, but classic colonial colonialism coming back, the speech about it, and even the Europeans kind of jumping on board again with this. Do you have any thoughts about this one?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. It's a moment of clarity. That's a good way to put it. And the Americans have always, they've always disregarded international law when they found it inconvenient because they could. I mean, they were the big military power, and the Canadian premier, announced in Davos, this was always a system that was based on hypocrisy, and we liked it because it favored us. But now things have got to change. Yeah, I think it's a little bit hypocritical of him and of the country of Canada too, because they seem to have no problem when Palestinians were being slaughtered throughout Gaza every single day. But now all of a sudden that the U.S. is turning on them. Oh, now we have to rethink the international order. But that's just part of the whole thing. So it's, in a way, it's a situation of clarity, and I don't know. I mean, when I was in Palestine, this was one of the things that UN people were saying, and that international observers were saying, international commentators were saying. It's actually good that we have a really right-wing government in Israel now, because now there's nothing hidden from view. Now we can all see it for what it is, and the countries of the world will be forced to deal with it. Well, they weren't. Nothing happened, right? And look and see, October 2023, Israel starts its overt genocide, and yet, and still it is not being held accountable. So, the fact that it's a moment of clarity, is important, but we also have to force governments to do something. Faced with that clarity, we have to make sure that action is taken, and that's the important thing. And that's what we have to do. I think we the citizenry, we have to keep on talking about this, keep on pushing our governments to abide by international law and to take this seriously and hold the baddies accountable. And it's an uphill struggle, but definitely for sure, inshallah, we will be victorious in the end.
I hope so. I mean, it's just we can't do this every other decade, and the genocide after genocide after genocide. And I must just say again, the Europeans and the Americans are just emigrated Europeans are just masters at genocide. They killed tens of millions of people. They kill 500,000 people every year just through economic sanctions. And we have like data on this now, Lancet studies, like 500,000 a year. And they say that we do this for the betterment of humanity. It's just it's absolutely insane. That insanity we need to get clarity on that one. And of course, the price is being paid by all the people slaughtered. But any kind of last thing that you would like to touch on that you think we haven't discussed yet that's important?
Well, I think we pretty much covered it all. And I think, like I just said, it's, and like you just said, I mean, it is important that we push our governments to take action. At the end of the day, that's really what it is. And, we can definitely do it. I mean, this is very much an international struggle. And I think, what you're doing with these videos and all your writing, I mean, that's also really important, because it's important we have to keep on talking about this. We have to keep on reaching out and making sure that we forge that we forge contacts, and that we have solidarity with people, in the rest of the world as well, because that's really important. And it'll happen. I mean, like I mentioned before, nobody predicted the wall coming down in Berlin. I mean, it's just nobody did it. Some people, so-called experts, later on, they're saying, "Oh yeah, this was inevitable." We always say, "No, it's not true. Nobody saw this coming." So, things can happen very dramatically, and there can be, for lack of a better word, there can be a revolution. And I'm looking forward to it.
And it's a Good Friday today. It's the Easter weekend, and there's always the hope that at some point, Jesus comes down over Salt Lake City and says, "Stop it now." Like, Mormons take over. Stop it now. We're gonna be peaceful from now on. Let's
see.
Or we will do it on our end. Saul, people who want to follow you, where should they go? Is there a place where you regularly publish things?
Yeah, this is one of the things I'm actually really bad at, and I've got to figure this out. I have to do this. There was, of course, you're probably familiar with what's it called now? Research Map, the one that the Japanese Quango organizes, and I was doing that. But of course, now after I've left to the UAE, that's not. I stopped updating that. I do have a website on Jimdo, and I will do a better job in updating that and making sure that that remains updated. But people can contact me through that. I mean, my contact details are on my Jimdo site, so that's one way to do. Yeah.
You will send me that one, the link, please, and
Yes,
I'll put it into the description box below.
I will do that. Yes.
And Saul Takahashi, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Pascal. It was great seeing you and great talking to you, and hope to see you again soon.